Welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The big newsmaker of the week, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is in Delhi to hold a commercial dialogue with India. Both nations signed a memorandum of understanding on semiconductor supply chains to decrease dependence on China and Taiwan. Raimondo held talks with Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar to discuss G20 goals, and also agreed to launch the India-US Strategic Trade Dialogue as well. Another key area of focus was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. India is not a full member of the group just yet, to differences over trade issues. Both India and US are hopeful of coming to a resolution by the end of the year.
One of the major outcomes of the commercial dialogue was the Memorandum of Understanding on establishing semiconductor supply chain and innovation partnership.
The United States partnership with India is one of our most consequential. And as strong as it is today, I believe we're entering into a period of increasing strength and closeness.
Let me now go across to Alexander Slater, Managing Director at US-India Business Council, and K Krishna Moorthy, President and CEO at India Electronics and Semiconductor Association. Mr. Krishna Moorthy, how significant is this? US already has a thriving semiconductor industry. India is taking its first steps towards semiconductor manufacturing. What could be the complementarities, the potential of a partnership between the CHIPS Act and the Semicon program of India?
Thank you, Parikshit, for getting me into this program, and good afternoon, Alexander. The United States probably, looking at it from a 10,000 feet level, is restarting its semiconductor manufacturing. And let us stay focused on the semiconductor manufacturing. And they were global leaders, and they are now coming back as a global leader. India, as you rightly said, is just taking its baby steps into big-time semiconductor manufacturing. But the supply chain for semiconductor manufacturing consists of about 150 materials, 30 plus gases, and a few other components. All put together, the supply chain consists of 200 plus items. And hence, this MoU, looking at announced by the Commerce Secretary, respected Gina Raimondo, is very, very critical for India as well as for US, I suppose. The critical part is that we have seen huge disruptions over the last 3 years, and how do we prevent that from happening in going forward? And then you look at the materials required for this manufacturing of semiconductors. Out of the 200 items, probably India already have categorized and cataloged 30 to 40 of them as available in India at different levels of quality and maturity. So how do we leverage this? And how can India become a supplier to the global semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem, in addition to what it can do when the fabs in India come up? So that's the context in which I will look at this MoU, and I'm pretty sure this will lead to a win-win situation for both US and India.
Right. Alexander, to ask you about the nitty-gritties of this MoU, Gina Raimondo has indicated that she would want US and India to collaborate in mapping global supply chains of semiconductors, assessing what the global demand is like, and making sure that both countries now are not over-incentivizing one particular kind of semiconductors and causing a glut in the global economy. How would this relationship actually work? When does US begin supporting us, and in what manner?
Parikshit, thanks so much for having me on to talk about this critical subject. And Mr. Krishna Moorthy, it's very good to be on the show with you, someone who's so knowledgeable about the sector in India. I think the key thing here is to take a larger approach to this. You know, if you step back to last year, 2022, when the Quad Leaders Summit in Japan at the beginning of the year, you had President Biden and Prime Minister Modi meet on the sidelines of that to create the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, which is a bilateral initiative that encompasses a variety of the technologies of the future that both countries believe really are going to be important to strategic relationships across the world. This included topics like biotechnology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and of course, semiconductors. And so today's announcement should be seen within the context of activating that process. In January, the U.S.-India Business Council hosted the official interaction on the sidelines of the launch of the ISET initiative, when National Security Advisor Doval and others from the government of India were in Washington, D.C., meeting with their counterparts there. At that meeting was Secretary Raimondo, Advisor Doval, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, among others. And we brought the industry together to talk through how to do exactly what you're talking about, Parikshit. How do we activate this in a nitty-gritty manner? And I think that the MoU that's coming out today is going to be the first step in that process. And everything is about moving from ideas to action and alignment. The key thing here is to be talking about ecosystems, not just one part of the semiconductor manufacturing process. India has incredible expertise in semiconductor design. This is not really just only about fabrication. A key area where I think the US and India can work together to add value is in the assembly, testing, and packaging of semiconductors. Much of that is now concentrated in East Asia, which is not good for anybody. I think we found that out during COVID, that any one country being a locus for a specific part of the global supply chain. India. And so India has a real opportunity here to take the lead in that area, working with the United States. And I would expect the MoU would help put in place a process for aligning our ecosystems in the nitty-gritty way, so that we're able to cover the full scope of things beyond fabrication. We'll be able to leverage the talent pool that India has on semiconductor design, and also the labor supply that India has to really boost the opportunity in the packaging, testing, and assembly space, which is really job intensive. And so it'll be really good for India to boost employment here, and very good for the United States to diversify that important service.
Right. Mr. Krishna Moorthy, coming back to you, Gina Raimondo, while speaking to Shireen Bhan, our managing editor, yesterday, also mentioned that there are a number of areas where India has very high tariffs on semiconductor manufacturing or components used in semiconductor manufacturing. Could you give us a sense of how many such products or component lines would there be, and how important is it to reduce and rationalize tariffs there if we really want to attract US companies?
Yeah, so if you look at the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, the market size today is about $180 billion worldwide, and which is expected to grow to $550 billion by 2030. And if you split this $550 billion pie into three major buckets, you will see that $200 million of that is for manufacturing equipments, about $150 billion is towards materials, and the remaining $150 billion is services. And services include what Alexander said just now, like ATMP and things like that. So leaving the manufacturing equipments out for the time being, for a moment, if you look at the $150 billion worth of materials that are required, and if India were to become a manufacturing powerhouse over a period of time, maybe 7 years, 10 years from now, India, there are two things that need to happen. Number one, the ease of access to these 200 plus materials need to be assured for the manufacturing entities to feel comfortable that it is quite possible and easy for them to run the manufacturing of semiconductors without any disruptions. And I will explain this with an example. Russia produces about 40% of the palladium, one of the critical components, materials that is required for semiconductor manufacturing. And Ukraine supplies 70% of the neon gas that is required, another requirement for semiconductor manufacturing. So now you can imagine what that conflict created and how it disrupted the availability of these two materials, just two materials out of this 200. Now, if we need to give that comfort to manufacturing entities that will come up in India for semiconductor manufacturing over a period of next 7 to 10 years, there are a large number of items where we need to have tariff adjustments, near term, medium term, and long term, and parallelly grow the ecosystem within India. And as I said,
Right.
some effort had been started, and about 30, 35 of them are, I would say, near that class, but still it leaves us 160, 170 materials which need to be imported. But the collaborative approach is exactly what will solve this problem, because one of the things where this collaboration can lead to is setting up qualification labs with global suppliers
Right.
coming in, and accelerating that process of making these materials available.
Right. Alexander, coming to you, what has been the interest? Because Gina Raimondo, in a press briefing, said last night that currently there are no specific firms which have made any commitments under this MoU so far. What has been the level of interest in companies in the United States in collaborating with their Indian counterparts or setting up manufacturing here? And will this MoU only be for handholding the private sector of two countries, trying to bring them together to collaborate? Or do you feel that there will be some concrete investments, monetary investments from the US government into India as well?
So I can't really speak for the governments. My role here is as a managing director of the U.S.-India Business Council. We're a trade association. And I really do know what our members feel and where they are on this. And I'll go back to my original comments and some of the things that we heard from Mr. Krishna Moorthy. The key thing here is to align ecosystems, and that's where I think the governments can play a critical role. You asked about the customs regime, right? If we're going to move forward in job-intensive areas that apply across the entire ecosystem beyond simply fabrication, right? And this is critical here. I think that's where most of the potential lies. But if we're going to do that, we need to get the customs regulations right. We need to allow for the import of intermediary goods. We talk about this beyond the semiconductor area a lot. You and I, Parikshit, have actually talked about this on air, that if India is going to be a global manufacturing hub, make in India, make for the world, it's got to have a customs system that has both regulations and is staffed by people who are able to allow intermediate goods to come into the country easily and get out of the country. And, the government's investment in CapEx that we've seen over the last 3 years in budgets really helps on that front, moving goods in and out of the country. But we also need a regulatory regime with capacity in human capital to execute on that. But in terms of U.S. company interest, I'd say, look, they're very interested in helping to diversify the supply chain of the entire ecosystem, right? That's where we really need to focus. It needs to be beyond just fabrication. Many of our members are deeply interested in setting up the capacity in India to assemble, package, and test chips here. And again, that is the most job-intensive part of the supply chain. Already, many of our members actually collaborate with R&D capacity here in India on the chip design sector. I've talked to, one of our members in particular talks about they have a close to 24-hour design cycle, because when the folks who are doing design in the United States go to sleep, their Indian counterparts pick up the designs and move them forward. And that just shows you one reason why this has such potential, that the skill level of India in that part of the ecosystem is on par with the United States. So very good things are happening. So the idea here now is, where can we find a win-win? Where do the U.S. companies want to develop additional capacity in India, and where does India have the capacity to fulfill that? I really do think that assembly, packaging, and testing is a way to go. And it'll be a plethora of jobs will come from that, really helping raise employment in India.
All right, we've run out of time, but Alexander, Slater, Mr. Krishna Moorthy, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on the big MoU that was signed between Gina Raimondo and Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal during this visit that will pave the way for strategic collaboration between India and US on semiconductors. Thanks once again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're taking a short break here on Global Eye, but coming up, a report by CrowdStrike Intelligence highlights that China has actively targeted nearly 40 nations via cyber espionage. We bring you a special discussion with Adam Mayers, Senior Vice President at CrowdStrike, after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. It's been a busy week for India with a series of bilateral meetings. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who watched the India-Australia test match with Prime Minister Modi on Thursday, held delegation-level talks today. The discussion focused on economy, trade, defence, security, energy, education, mobility, as well as regional and multilateral issues. Prime Minister Modi raised the issue of attacks on temples in Australia. The Australian Prime Minister assured the government of safety and security of temples in his country. And moving on, 2022 witnessed an increase in global malware threat and cyber espionage. This according to a report published by CrowdStrike. The report highlighted that China has dominated the cyber espionage landscape and was rated as one of the most active intrusion groups. The report also highlighted that Chinese adversaries are targeting nearly 39 global industry sectors across 20 geographic regions that CrowdStrike tracks. I caught up with Adam Mayers, Senior Vice President at CrowdStrike, and began by asking him about the cyber espionage trends the organization has observed.
We've seen Chinese activity across every business vertical that we track and every geographic region that we track. They've been endemic across the globe in conducting cyber espionage operations. And one of the notable facets of how they operate is that we've seen an increase in exploitation. They've been finding new vulnerabilities in various products and exploiting them to get access to these organizations.
Adam, if I were to ask you to quantify the extent to which the Chinese espionage has increased, could you give us a number of the kind of attacks or the number of attacks that you saw in 2022 over 2021?
I don't have a number explicitly for that, but what I would say is that we've seen them in more locations and more victims over the course of the last year, and notably so over the previous year.
Any key sectors that, and were these state actors or were these private entities targeting entities around the world? Could you also give us a sense of the kind of sectors that were targeted?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen them very heavily in telecom. We've seen them also very heavily in, all sectors, as I said, but it depends on region. So, for example, in Central Asia, a lot of government targeting. In Oceania, they were going after energy, academia, nuclear power, government, telecom, healthcare, manufacturing. In East Asia, pretty widespread of things to adding things like real estate and aerospace there as well. In Southeast Asia, again, a widespread academia and energy and telecoms and healthcare, all very heavily targeted, as well as defense. So it's a global problem and it affects every industry and, as I said, every geographic region. Right.
If I were to ask you about India specifically, what are the kind of espionage activities that were targeted towards India? How did the strikes increase in 2022? And were the bulk of cyber crimes in India traced back to China, for that matter?
Yeah, so I would say it's not necessarily a cybercrime issue when we're talking about China. This is espionage. They're stealing intellectual property in many cases, but they're also stealing things that will enable political, military, and diplomatic decision-making. And obviously, with the conflicts between China and India around the line of actual control and some of the increased tensions in that region, we have seen that espionage targeting political and military and defense industries is most prevalent in India.
Right. And all of these were, how would you describe these attacks? Mostly, this was for stealing information, or was it to destabilize websites, destabilize the financial system, or cybersecurity of certain sensitive government departments?
It's espionage. So they would be looking to understand troop movements. They would be looking to understand decision-making processes, understanding how and where they would need to push in order to get a specific reaction that they're looking for from the Indian government. And also in the case of broader context of India, if there's industries or technology that they'd like to steal and replicate, also if they're competing for projects. So if there's high-speed rail or telecom or infrastructure projects that China is bidding on, they would use that to get a competitive advantage in that bidding process.
Right. That indeed is significant. If I were to also ask you about the vulnerabilities that companies and government departments need to plug, Which are these vulnerabilities which have been repeatedly targeted by adversaries?
So we've seen a wide array of things. From a China perspective, to kind of pivot off of that, they have been very heavily targeting things like Microsoft Exchange, particularly on-prem. They have been very effective in targeting various remote access tools and trying to use that to gain their initial access. We've also seen across the world a lot of social engineering, where they are various threat actors are attempting to log in using stolen credentials, or they'll use phishing attacks to gather the credentials to then log in with. And one of the things that we note in our report is that there's been a 70% of the intrusions are what we call malware free, meaning they're not using malware that would be detected by an antivirus. This is a threat actor just logging in and then using what we call hands-on keyboard to live off the land. They're using the tools that are already present in that environment and staying undetected as a result of that. So the vulnerabilities impact a lot of different products, for sure, but we also have seen this increase in that hands-on keyboard kind of living off the land approach, where they're just using credentials that are either stolen or phished from the target.
Right. In how many cases in India do you think that these Chinese espionage activities were successful in stealing information and penetrating sensitive government departments?
They have had some degree of success. I can't necessarily assess exactly where they were successful or how successful, but the Chinese are extremely adept at doing these types of operations. They've been doing it for the better part of 2 decades. And in India, they will no doubt have some success by just a factor of how frequently they're coming and how the tactics that they're using. So, one of the things that we advise is that organizations really invest in security. You can't stick your head in the sand and hope it's not going to happen to you. If you're in a business vertical that is of interest to China, you're absolutely going to get targeted. If you are dealing with large amounts of money or cryptocurrency, then North Korea is another threat actor to be concerned about. And we also have observed ransomware and things like that spreading across the globe to traditionally they focused on a lot of English-speaking targets, but they're expanding that over the last year or so. And we're also seeing the growth of data extortion. In fact, 20% of the threat actors that do ransomware are no longer even using the ransomware. They're strictly logging in, stealing data, and then disclosing it on the internet if you don't pay their extortion demand. So there's been a massive uptick in that activity as well.
All right, so China's cyber espionage activities are only increasing, according to CrowdStrike, and India was also targeted several times, especially political and military establishments, for data on troop movements and other sensitive activities. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.